Your reckless disregard for proper referral protocols represents everything wrong with nurses overstepping their boundaries. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 47 minutes before the military convoy arrived at Cedar Creek Medical. The Grand Rounds Theatre held 70 staff members. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects. The smell of antiseptic and stale coffee hung in the air, thick enough to taste. Natalie Hayes stood at the back wall, her hands perfectly still at her sides. Every pair of eyes in the room had turned toward her the moment Caldwell spoke her name. He gestured toward her with the casual cruelty of a man accustomed to absolute authority. His finger traced the air like a courtroom accusation. This is precisely the kind of unauthorized scope creep that undermines physician-led care models. Natalie did not blinch. Did not shift her weight. Her jaw remained level, her breathing controlled. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Caldwell controlled the room with the effortless confidence of someone who had spent 32 years reinforcing hierarchy. He chaired the hospital ethics committee. He sat on 3 separate credentialing boards. His word could end careers. His phone call could blacklist a nurse from every major medical center in the Pacific Northwest. He knew this. The room knew this. Natalie knew this. What Caldwell didn't know was that Natalie had been embedded at Cedar Creek Medical for 18 months under deep cover, tasked with monitoring a suspected medical fraud network that reached far beyond hospital walls. A deaf patient presents to our facility, Caldwell continued, his voice carrying the tone of a professor addressing undergraduate students. 12 different physicians, 12, have evaluated this individual and appropriately declined to engage given the liability concerns, communication barriers, and documented scheduling conflicts. Appropriate medical judgment. Appropriate caution. 12. The number sat there like a stone. Marcus Chen. The name hadn't been introduced yet, but Natalie knew it. She knew that 12 doctors across 6 weeks had turned him away. She knew the exact sequence of refusals. She knew that Marcus had been a Black Hawk pilot before his injuries. She knew that his deteriorating cardiac condition would kill him within weeks if someone didn't intervene. She knew because she had been watching, coordinating, arranging care through channels that did not officially exist. And yet, Caldwell said, pausing for effect, someone in this hospital took it upon themselves to bypass the entire referral structure. To coordinate treatment without physician approval. Without ethics board review. Without administrative oversight. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. This was not heroism. This was not compassion. This was a fundamental violation of professional boundaries that jeopardizes every patient safety protocol we have established. Natalie watched him. She did not look away. She did not acknowledge the residents in the 3rd row who were beginning to smirk. She did not react to the attending physician who was studiously examining his notes, refusing to make eye contact. She simply stood at the back wall with her hands perfectly still, her face showing nothing. Only her eyes, dark, unblinking, the color of a stormy Atlantic, registered anything at all. The medication cart beside her was organized with military precision. Syringes aligned. Vials sorted by concentration and expiration date. Her fingers, resting against the cold stainless steel edge, bore thin white scar tissue across the knuckles. Old scars. Deliberate ones. The kind that only appeared on hands that had done things in conditions most people would consider impossible. I am initiating a formal review of all unauthorized treatment coordination. Caldwell's voice had taken on the rhythm of an official pronouncement. Should any staff member discover additional violations, you are obligated to report them to this office immediately. Is that understood? The room acknowledged. Murmurs. Nods. The social order reaffirmed. The grand rounds dispersed 20 minutes later. Bodies filtered out through the double doors. Natalie waited until the crowd had thinned, then moved through the ICU corridors with economy of movement that suggested her body understood terrain in ways other bodies did not. She carried a slight favor to her left leg, not quite a limp, but a precision in how her weight distributed with each step. 18 months of embedded operations meant 18 months of favoring an old shrapnel injury that had never fully healed. The supply closet was empty at 2:14 p.m. on a Tuesday. Natalie was restocking trauma shears when the door opened behind her. "You cut his sutures open." "Not a question." The voice belonged to a veteran hospital security guard named James Mitchell, former Marine, who had recognized something in the way Natalie had sutured an emergency laceration 3 days earlier. Military field suturing technique. Not taught in civilian nursing programs. Not something you learned in textbooks. Something you learned in places where sterile technique was a luxury and infection control meant keeping a soldier alive long enough for medevac. Mitchell was looking at her hands. Specifically at the scar tissue on her knuckles and the precise calluses that formed only from decades of weapon handling and field medicine. Natalie's carefully blank expression cracked for exactly half a second. Just enough for Mitchell to see something move behind her eyes: recognition, assessment, the briefest acknowledgement of a truth neither of them could speak. "The laceration was too contaminated for standard closure," Natalie said, her voice steady and deferential, the voice of a nurse speaking to hospital security. "Tension sutures provided better edge approximation without restricting blood flow. Standard practice in austere environments." She turned back to the shelf. Her hands had resumed their steady work. The moment had passed. Mitchell stood there for a few seconds longer, then left without another word. The door clicked shut. The supply closet hummed with the exhaust of the ventilation system. The break room at 3:33 p.m. held 3 occupied lockers. Natalie opened hers, and the interior revealed exactly what you would expect from a Portland-based registered nurse: scrubs folded with military precision, a granola bar, a water bottle, an extra pair of socks. And at the very bottom, a pair of worn combat boots. Desert tan. Scuffed at the heel. The leather cracked with age and exposure. Another nurse, Stephanie, ICU day shift, glanced over while pouring coffee. "What's with the boots?" "Running," Natalie said without hesitation. "Those look military." "Trail running." Natalie closed the locker with the same careful precision she applied to everything. "Terrain grip." The explanation was offered without additional elaboration. Stephanie accepted it because people generally accepted what nurses told them about their own lives, because asking too many questions about a quiet coworker seemed intrusive, because no one had yet developed the capacity to see what was genuinely standing in front of them. Natalie moved through the remainder of the shift with absolute efficiency. 2 patients extubated. 1 new admission with septic shock requiring immediate central line placement. A family conversation about palliative care options that required sitting with a daughter while she wept and made impossible decisions. By 11:11 p.m., the ICU had stabilized. The monitors beeped their rhythmic reassurance. Oxygen saturation steady. Cardiac rhythm normal sinus. Everything in its place. She was entering medication orders into the electronic system when Dr. Caldwell entered the nurse's station. He was holding a chart. His expression had shifted from the theatrical authority of grand rounds to something more focused. More predatory. The shift in his body language was subtle but complete, like a hunter who had chosen his target and was now circling closer. "Natalie." He used her first name, which meant he was escalating. "I've been reviewing the Marcus Chen case file. I want to know exactly what treatment coordination you initiated." She did not look up from the computer screen. Her hands continued entering orders with the same measured tempo. "I'm not sure what you mean, Dr. Caldwell." "Don't." His voice dropped to something that wasn't quite a whisper but held the same threat. "I have documentation that someone with access to the EHR and medication protocols has been coordinating care for this patient without physician oversight. 16 different staff members have reported seeing you with Marcus Chen. 16. Do you understand what kind of position that puts this hospital in?" Natalie finished entering the order. She closed the screen. Only then did she turn to face him. Her eyes were steady. Her voice, when it came, was soft enough that only he could hear it across the medication station. I documented patient education sessions regarding his cardiac condition. That's within nursing scope of practice. Caldwell leaned closer. His breathing had accelerated slightly. The tremor in his voice was not anger, not yet. It was something more calculated. Something that had been trained over decades in boardrooms and credentialing meetings. If I discover that you have performed any procedure or treatment recommendation without physician authorization, I will have security escort you out of this hospital. Is that clear? Very clear, Dr. Caldwell. Good. He straightened, and the predatory focus shifted back to administrative confidence. He turned to leave, then paused at the threshold. And Natalie? Stay away from Marcus Chen. The man is a liability we don't need. The doors to the ICU hissed shut behind him. Natalie stood motionless at the medication station for 3 seconds. The monitors continued their steady beeping. Around her, the hospital functioned with the ordinary precision of a place where life and death were processed according to protocol. Where 12 doctors could refuse a man care. Where hierarchy was enforced by people who had never held a life in their hands while artillery fell like rain. She returned to the screens. She continued her work. Her composure remained perfect, her hand steady, her face showing nothing. But somewhere inside, in the place where 18 months of operational discipline had been holding back the truth, something was beginning to move. The night shift continued. The monitors beeped. The fluorescent lights buzzed. And Natalie Hayes, who had carried a man 6 miles through enemy fire, who had given him her protective gear while bleeding herself, who had returned to this hospital to finish what she had started, waited for whatever came next. The cardiac monitors beeping echoed down the 3rd-floor corridor as Natalie restocked the crash cart, her movements precise and efficient, when her phone buzzed with a text from the ER charge nurse, Marcus Chen. Sister brought him in. Vitals crashing. Her jaw tightened. She didn't allow herself to look up from the ambu bag she was securing. Not yet. But the moment felt like a tripwire, the kind that changes everything. 30 minutes earlier, Dr. Caldwell had returned to his office on the administrative floor, the Grand Rounds Theatre still echoing with scattered laughter behind him. He closed his door, sat at his mahogany desk, the kind that cost more than most nurses made in 3 months, and picked up his phone. The hospital board president's personal line rang at 8:38 p.m. on a Tuesday. Caldwell didn't apologize for the hour. "We have a serious scope of practice violation," he said, his voice steady as a surgeon's hand. "A nurse named Hayes has been coordinating care for a patient without proper physician authorization. I need this documented and escalated before she becomes a liability." The board president listened. He had 14 other problems that night, but Caldwell's voice carried the particular authority of a man who'd spent 23 years building alliances. By the time they hung up, Natalie's name was flagged in 3 separate administrative systems. The next call came at 8:52 p.m. Caldwell dialed the dean of nursing at Portland State University, the school where Natalie had earned her RN license 11 years ago. "I'm requesting her complete personnel file and credentialing history," he said. "There are questions about her initial background check. Whether her references were properly vetted." He didn't say what he was looking for. He didn't need to. The dean, who had received Caldwell's donation to the university's new simulation lab just 8 months earlier, promised to pull everything by morning. "I appreciate your thoroughness," Caldwell said. "Patient safety comes first." The dean heard the edge in those words. Understood the implication. A school's reputation rests on the nurses it graduates. At 9:06 p.m., Caldwell's 3rd call went to the state licensing board. He reached the after-hours emergency line and spoke to a duty officer. "I'm requesting an investigation into RN license number 247-884-331, he said. "Natalie Hayes, Cedar Creek Medical. There are concerns about credential authenticity and scope of practice violations. I wanted to flag this before there's a patient safety incident." He gave Hayes's name slowly, deliberately, each syllable a separate hammer strike. The duty officer recorded everything. By morning, the licensing board would have an open file with Caldwell's name at the top as the reporting physician. Natalie received the suspension notice at 7:15 a.m. the next day, printed on hospital letterhead and delivered by the HR director with an apology in her eyes but protocol in her voice. Effective immediately, your clinical privileges are suspended pending investigation into credential verification and scope of practice concerns. You are not to contact patients, enter patient rooms, or perform any nursing duties. Report to HR for your badge and facility access to be suspended. The word sat on the page like judgment. She read it once. Didn't read it again. Her hands were steady as she turned in her badge. The security guard didn't meet her eyes. He didn't need to. Cedar Creek Medical had already decided what she was. She sat in her car in the parking lot for 14 minutes, engine off, hands on the steering wheel. The rain had started around dawn, that Portland rain that feels personal, that hammers the windshield like applause for something she couldn't name. Her suspension letter sat on the passenger seat, still warm from the printer. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She'd been trained not to break. Not when stakes were this high. Not when a veteran was dying in the building behind her. By noon, Caldwell had expanded his network. He placed a call to the hospital's credentialing committee chair, then to the chief of medical staff, then to the patient safety officer. In each conversation, he mentioned the investigation, the licensing board inquiry, the potential liability of keeping an improperly credentialed nurse on staff. He didn't lie. He didn't need to. The truth, carefully framed, was its own weapon. Within 5 hours, Natalie's suspension was locked in place with the weight of institutional machinery behind it. Her name appeared in the hospital's internal incident tracking system. The memo was copied to 7 different departments. Cedar Creek Medical had 78 nurses on active staff. By end of shift, 43 of them had heard that Natalie Hayes had been suspended for practicing outside her scope. The version of her that remained was smaller and smaller with each retelling. Dr. Caldwell sat in his office that afternoon, conference call running on speakerphone with 2 other hospital administrators and a lawyer from the legal department. "We're building documentation," the lawyer said. "If this goes to litigation, we need to show we acted swiftly and appropriately." Caldwell agreed. He always agreed. He had spent 23 years at Cedar Creek, building a reputation as the physician who protected physician authority, who understood the importance of hierarchy. He was the kind of administrator who scheduled lunches with board members, who sponsored the hospital's annual golf tournament, who understood that institutional power flows to those willing to enforce it. Natalie Hayes was an inconvenience. A nurse who'd crossed a line. A problem that could be solved with a phone call and the right words in the right ears. But what Caldwell didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that the woman he'd just destroyed on paper had spent the last 18 months embedded at Cedar Creek Medical under direct orders from Naval Special Warfare Command. She wasn't supposed to help Marcus Chen. She wasn't supposed to coordinate his care or challenge the 12 different physicians who'd refused him. She was supposed to document the network of physicians running a medical fraud scheme worth $4.2 million annually, moving patients with government benefits between hospitals, padding procedures, triggering unnecessary surgeries. 18 months of operational security. 18 months of walking the line between being helpful enough to maintain her cover and being invisible enough to avoid scrutiny. And Natalie Hayes had just burned it all down. In the moment she'd touched Marcus Chen's arm in that hallway and promised him someone would listen, in the moment she'd coordinated his care and signed herself into patient records, she'd chosen him over the mission. She'd chosen one deaf veteran over the takedown of a multi-million-dollar conspiracy. The men at Naval Special Warfare Command who'd sent her would now have to decide whether to pull her immediately or let her finish what she'd started before Caldwell's machinery crushed her completely. Natalie wasn't in her car anymore. She'd driven to a 24-hour diner on Division Street, the kind of place that doesn't ask questions, that serves coffee that tastes like iron and possibility. Her phone sat on the laminate table in front of her. No messages. No calls. Just the weight of 18 months of work collapsing like a controlled demolition. She had one card left to play, and if she played it wrong, she'd compromise not just herself but every operative still embedded in Portland's medical network. One wrong move and the conspiracy would scatter. One wrong move and Marcus Chen would die in Cedar Creek Medical, another statistic, another deaf man nobody listened to. The coffee cooled in front of her. The rain continued outside. And then, at 11:16 p.m. on the night of day 2, the hospital paged for a rapid response in the emergency department. Natalie's phone, still active because she hadn't powered it down, because part of her knew what was coming, buzzed with a text from a junior resident she'd trained. Asterisk, it's him. He's crashing. You need to see this. Asterisk, she was already reaching for her keys. The ER at Cedar Creek Medical was chaos at 11:19 p.m. Ambulance doors burst open and Marcus Chen came through on a stretcher, his body rigid, skin the color of wet concrete. His sister Sarah ran alongside, signing frantically, her hands shaking so badly the movements became abstract. 6 weeks. She had kept a handwritten list of the 12 doctors who'd refused him. 12 names in a spiral notebook she'd carried like a weapon she couldn't fire. Pericardial effusion, the paramedic called out. Progression to tamponade. BP 88/56 and dropping. He's deteriorating fast. The attending physician, Dr. Patel, met them in Trauma Bay 3. His eyes did that thing they always do when confronted with a deaf patient, a split-second calculation of liability, a mental inventory of consent complications, a decision already forming before the patient even reached the bed. The heart monitor beeped its frantic rhythm. Beep. 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 Each pulse a countdown that nobody was winning. Get him prepped for transfer, Patel said, already stepping back. This complexity, we're not equipped. We need cardiothoracic on site. Sarah's hands flew. No. Stay. Help him. Natalie was there before the order finished. She'd been running restocks when the trauma alert came through the overhead speakers. Code blue. Trauma 3. She moved through the corridors like water finding a path, no hesitation, no wasted motion. Someone had trained her body to recognize emergencies the way other people recognized their own heartbeat. He needs to stay, Natalie said. Her voice didn't rise. It just changed frequency, dropped an octave, became the kind of quiet that makes people listen. Pericardiocentesis. Now. The patient is deaf, Patel said. Consent procedures alone. His sister is here. She consents. Write it down if it makes you feel safer. That was when Caldwell appeared. He had the gift of timing that hospital administrators possess, the ability to materialize exactly when a situation was about to slip from administrative control. His phone was already in his hand, his eyes already calculating the liability exposure, the regulatory exposure, the exposure to his own authority. This patient needs transfer, Caldwell said. Protocol requires. Natalie pulled the ultrasound machine to Marcus's bedside. Her hands were steady as surgical steel. The kind of steady that comes from muscle memory, from having done this before under conditions that made a hospital trauma bay look like a resort spa. She prepped his skin with betadine in 2 sweeps. The antiseptic smell rose sharp and chemical. 14-gauge needle, she said. It wasn't a request. A resident froze. Now, Natalie said. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She guided the ultrasound probe across Marcus's chest, watching the pericardial sac fill with blood like a balloon pumping darker. The effusion was massive. The heart was drowning. Caldwell watched her hands position the needle with the precision of someone placing a warhead through a keyhole, millimeters away from the coronary arteries, from the descending aorta, from structures that would kill him if they were nicked. She didn't look up. She didn't hesitate. The needle advanced under real-time ultrasound visualization. Needle entry, she announced. The sac punctured. Air hissed out, that small whisper of pressure releasing, the sound of a sealed system finally breathing. Blood began flowing into the collection syringe. Dark. Thick. Alive. How is she doing this? Patel whispered. In the ER waiting room, 30 feet away through a reinforced window, the veteran combat medic from the supply closet, the one who'd recognized her field suturing technique weeks earlier, pushed through the double doors. He needed to be closer. His hands were shaking. A nurse tried to redirect him, but he was already moving, already at the trauma bay window, his eyes locked on the procedure. His breath caught. That's a tactical combat casualty care approach, he whispered to the nurse beside him, his voice tight. That's not something you learn in nursing school. That's a battlefield technique. He stopped. He was watching hands that had clearly done this before, in sand and darkness and under fire, where seconds of hesitation meant body bags. Natalie withdrew the syringe. 180 cubic centimeters of bloody fluid. The pericardial sac began to decompress. Marcus's chest expanded slightly. The monitor's tempo changed. Beep. 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 Slower now. Steadier. O2 sat was 68, a tech announced. Now 78. Climbing. 82, 85. BP recovering, another voice. 90 over 58. 95 over 62. The vitals stabilized. The room exhaled. It was a moment of pure physics, mechanical relief of pressure, oxygen saturation climbing, cardiac output returning, a human body remember how to live because someone had known exactly where to put a needle. Natalie withdrew the ultrasound probe and began securing the catheter with practiced efficiency. One hand holding the line steady while the other taped. She didn't look at Caldwell. She didn't acknowledge the silence that had fallen over the trauma bay like snow. She just moved through the next steps of the procedure with the methodical grace of someone who had done harder things in darker places. But Caldwell was already on his phone. She could see his jaw working, the color rising in his face, the phone pressed to his ear before she'd even finished the last piece of tape. He was walking into the hallway, already dialing, already building the architecture of her destruction. By 1:15 a.m., Caldwell had the hospital board president out of bed. They golfed together every Wednesday at Riverside Country Club. We have a nurse who just performed an invasive surgical procedure without physician supervision, Caldwell said, his voice steady and certain. No credentialing for operative procedures. No board review. She violated fundamental protocols. I need an emergency credentialing review convened immediately. By 2:53 a.m., he'd contacted Natalie's nursing school at Oregon Health and Science University. I'm requesting her complete academic file, all references, and detailed documentation of any clinical training she received in invasive procedures. This is regarding an incident that occurred at my facility. By 3:45 a.m., the state licensing board received his formal complaint. 18 pages. Detailed. Methodical. Weaponized. Natalie was in the physician's lounge when the security guard found her. His name was Thompson. He'd been a Marine before this job, before a roadside IED took his left leg and his confidence in everything else. He knew what was coming. He always did. You need to come with me, he said quietly. Where? Administration wants your badge and access revoked. It's hospital protocol pending review. I'm sorry. She followed him to the locker room without speaking. Her hands were still steady. There was no trembling. No face burning. No voice cracking. She'd learned long ago that the ones who break visibly are the ones who haven't been broken before. She walked like someone who had already survived the worst and found it survivable. In the hallway outside, the veteran combat medic was waiting. His expression had shifted from confusion to something closer to understanding. He'd seen enough people who'd been through what this nurse had been through. He recognized the architecture of PTSD in the way she moved, how she conserved energy, how her eyes tracked exits, how her shoulders stayed loose for sudden movement. He'd lived in that same house. Hey, he said as she emerged from the locker room, her small personal bag in one hand. I know what you did in there wasn't normal. Natalie stopped. For the first time since arriving at Cedar Creek Medical, she made direct eye contact with someone who truly saw her. Procedure was indicated, she said. Patient was deteriorating. Right. He nodded slowly. And you learned that procedure where exactly? She moved past him without answering. But as she walked toward the elevator, her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only betrayal of her composure, the only crack in the surface. A security guard escort trailed behind her, his presence both protection and imprisonment. In the ER below, Marcus Chen's oxygen saturation was holding steady at 94%. His heart was beating in normal sinus rhythm. His sister's hands had finally stopped shaking. By sunrise, the formal notification arrived in Natalie's email, copied to the State Licensing Board, the hospital's legal team, and the Nursing Board of Oregon. Suspension effective immediately. Badge revoked. Access to Cedar Creek Medical terminated pending investigation review. The words were bureaucratic, anonymous, institutional. They were also a nail in the coffin of her 18 months of operational security, 18 months of embedded surveillance on the medical fraud network Caldwell was operating, 18 months of patience and precision that had just been obliterated by the simple act of saving a deaf veteran's life. She sat in her apartment, rain hammering against the windows like applause or accusation, depending on how you heard it. Her hands, the same hands that had guided a needle through blood and tissue with millimeter precision, were folded on her lap. Steady. Waiting for the phone to ring, for the next orders, for someone to tell her what came next when the quiet warrior finally made noise. Dr. Caldwell's hands moved with surgical precision across his office desk, but surgery wasn't his specialty. Strategy was. He lifted the phone at 6:56 a.m., before the hospital board president had finished his first coffee, before the ethics committee convened, before anyone could spin the narrative in Natalie's favor. His voice came smooth as warmed oil. I need the board president. It's urgent. 30 seconds of hold music. Then, David, it's Marcus Caldwell. We have a serious problem at Cedar Creek. One of our nurses just performed an invasive procedure, a pericardiocentesis, without physician authorization. Full scope creep. She's not credentialed for that level of intervention. He let that sit. Let it breathe like a wound opening. I'm requesting we open a formal investigation into her credentials. Her background. Everything. The board president's voice came through thin with concern. Has anyone filed a complaint? I'm filing it now, Caldwell said. And I'm calling her nursing school directly. If she misrepresented her qualifications during hiring, that's a liability exposure the hospital can't absorb. By 7:15 a.m., he had the Dean of Nursing at Portland State on the line. Her performance evaluations. Her original applications. Everything that showed clinical competence beyond standard ICU scope. I need dates, references, any indication she'd received an authorized training. The Dean's voice came cautious now, protective. Dr. Caldwell, without a formal legal request, this is a formal request from hospital administration, he said, his tone dropping the temperature in the room. A patient safety matter. Do we have an understanding? By 8:11 a.m., before Natalie had even clocked in for her shift, Caldwell had already contacted the Oregon State Board of Nursing. The conversation with the licensing investigator took 9 minutes. Master Chief Petty Officer, the woman at the board said, reading from a form Caldwell had triggered online. Registered Nurse License, issued 2019. Specialty certifications include critical care, trauma response, and emergency procedures beyond her credentialing. Caldwell interrupted. I'm requesting an immediate investigation into whether she fraudulently obtained her license or misrepresented her training history. The machinery was already turning. 3 phone calls. 18 minutes. A lifetime of professional reputation being methodically dismantled by a man who'd spent 3 decades learning exactly which levers to pull. At 9:43 a.m., Natalie received the official suspension notice. A manila envelope, hand-delivered by hospital security to the break room where she was reviewing medication orders. The letter was dated that morning, printed on Cedar Creek medical letterhead, signed by the chief nursing officer, someone Caldwell clearly had on speed dial. Pending investigation into credentialing irregularities and scope of practice violations, your employment is suspended effective immediately. Your hospital privileges are revoked. Your access badge is deactivated. Report to Human Resources to surrender your credentials. Her jaw didn't move. Her hands didn't shake. She read the letter twice, folded it with the same precision she'd used on surgical drapes 1,000 times, and placed it in her scrub pocket. Another nurse, the same one who'd avoided eye contact yesterday, stared at her from the corner. Natalie met her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, then turned and walked toward the ICU to finish her shift, because they hadn't told her to leave yet, and she followed orders. But that wasn't the worst part. The paperwork would take hours. Exit interview. Badge return. Credential verification. Background check. The machinery that ground up careers had already locked around her ankles and was beginning to pull. She moved through the ICU like a ghost in scrubs, finishing vitals on the 3 patients still under her care, handing off her notes with a kind of clinical detail that would make any replacement nurse look careless by comparison. At 2:15 p.m., when her shift officially ended, she didn't go home. Instead, she walked down to the basement level of Cedar Creek Medical, to the hospital laundry facility where the industrial washers hummed like sleeping machinery and the air hung thick with the smell of bleach and heat. The laundry room was mostly empty. One attendant sorting linens, not looking up. Natalie opened her locker, the same locker she'd used for 18 months, since Naval Special Warfare Command had embedded her at Cedar Creek Medical under deep cover, and removed her folded scrubs. 7 sets of blue cotton, each one perfectly laundered, each one smelling of antiseptic and that faint metallic edge of betadine that never quite washed out. She'd worn these scrubs through 234 shifts. Through the surveillance operation that had documented Dr. Caldwell's pattern of unnecessary referrals. Through the documentation of surgical billing fraud. Through the photography of falsified patient charts. Through 18 months of watching, waiting, collecting intelligence on a suspected medical fraud network that ran deeper than anyone outside naval intelligence knew. She unfolded the first set of scrubs slowly. The blue cotton was soft from 100 washings, the hem slightly frayed where it caught on equipment. She folded it again with military precision, thirds first, then in half, the corners meeting exactly. The fabric still held the faint scent of antiseptic, yes, but underneath that was something else. Sweat. Fear. The smell of a human being performing emergency procedures in a darkened trauma bay while everything fell apart outside the walls. The fabric against her palms was still damp from the last wash cycle. Still warm from the industrial dryer. This was the final indignity. Not the suspension. Not the investigation. Not the career that was about to disintegrate in the eyes of every medical institution in Oregon. This moment. This specific moment, standing alone in a basement laundry room, folding the last piece of her cover story, the blue cotton growing heavier with each fold because it wasn't just fabric anymore. It was the end of something. It was the moment when the mission went quiet forever. The combat boots sat in her locker beside the scrubs. She'd carried them with her for 18 months. Standard issue boots from 2016, scuffed leather, broken-in soles, the kind of thing a civilian nurse would never own, would never understand. She'd kept them at the bottom of her locker, beneath the civilian clothes, beneath the pharmacy reference books, beneath the carefully constructed life of Natalie Hayes, RN. But the boots were evidence. The boots remembered. The boots knew exactly who was folding these scrubs in a hospital basement at 2:33 p.m. on a Tuesday, and why. She placed the folded scrubs in the return bin, each set aligned perfectly with the others. Blue cotton on top of more blue cotton. Layers of a life that was about to vaporize. Then she removed her hospital ID badge, the one with her photograph and Natalie Hayes, RN printed below it, and set it on top of the folded scrubs. The badge had been her anchor to this identity for 18 months. The badge had gotten her through 7 different security checkpoints. The badge had given her access to medication records, surgical schedules, billing systems. The badge had made her invisible because everyone saw what the badge said and stopped looking deeper. Now it was sitting in a laundry bin, and the machine that was supposed to have taken 18 more months to complete was being accelerated toward its conclusion. A handler from Naval Special Warfare Command would be waiting in the parking garage. Not a phone call. Not a text message. Face to face, because when an operation went hot, there was no secure line thick enough to hide what needed to be said. She'd received the signal 3 hours ago, a simple text from a number that didn't exist, music store. Usual time. The music store was the dead drop location 2 blocks from Cedar Creek Medical. The usual time was always dusk. She'd done this 17 times before, leaving intelligence in a locker, receiving instructions in return. This time would be different. This time they'd be telling her the operation was over. The pericardiocentesis had been the trigger. Performing that procedure in front of witnesses, the ER attending, 2 nurses, the charge nurse, Marcus Chen himself, had exposed her clinical knowledge beyond anything a standard ICU nurse should possess. A standard ICU nurse didn't have the muscle memory to thread a needle through the pericardial sac with the precision of someone who'd done it in worse conditions. A standard ICU nurse didn't move with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed emergency procedures in field hospitals, in combat zones, with nothing but a headlamp and a prayer. The moment her hands had moved on their own, muscle memory taking over, she'd burned the entire operation. 18 months. That's what Naval Special Warfare Command had invested in this single embedded operative at Cedar Creek Medical. 18 months of photography, documentation, surveillance of a billing fraud network that was allegedly funneling millions through unnecessary surgical procedures. The fraud itself was small, 10,000 here, 15,000 there, accumulated across hundreds of cases. But the network behind it was significant. There were people who needed to face federal charges. There were institutional systems that needed dismantling. There was evidence that she was supposed to have compiled over 22 more months before being extracted. But Dr. Caldwell had accelerated everything. His investigation would pull at threads that led directly to her Navy credentials. They couldn't let that happen. They couldn't have the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Naval Criminal Investigative Service trampling through an active intelligence operation. Better to blow the op now, on her terms, than to have her cover destroyed by a licensing board investigation that would inevitably intersect with classified military records. She placed her locker key on the folded scrubs, turned away from the bin without looking back, and walked toward the parking garage where a man in a dark coat would be waiting. The basement laundry room hummed with the sound of industrial machinery. Water rushing. Chemicals mixing. Heat building. The machinery that turned blood-stained fabric into clean cloth, that erased evidence, that made things disappear. She'd made Marcus Chen disappear from certain death. But she hadn't been able to save her own mission. Some choices didn't have good options. Some choices just determined which way you failed. The parking garage was empty except for the black SUV parked in the corner, lights off, engine running. She could see him waiting in the front seat. Commander James Mitchell, Naval Special Warfare Command. 17 years her senior. Had signed off on her assignment 18 months ago when she'd volunteered to go undercover at a civilian hospital instead of deploying with her SEAL team. Had told her that intelligence work was just as critical as direct action. Had told her that sometimes the most important battles were fought in silence. She opened the passenger door and sat down without preamble. The vehicle smelled like coffee and diesel fuel. His voice came flat, professional, the way it always did. The pericardiocentesis compromised operational security. 18 months of observation is now a liability instead of an asset. The patient was dying, Natalie said. Her voice came level. Measured. I understand. He didn't look at her. He stared at the concrete wall in front of them. Naval intelligence is pulling you out. We've already moved to protect the documentation you compiled. Dr. Caldwell isn't part of the fraud ring, but his investigation into your background is pulling threads we can't afford. The moment the state licensing board connects your nursing credentials with your military record, the entire operation becomes compromised. She felt something shift inside her chest. Not fear. Not regret. Something more like the moment before a mission went active, when all the planning was finished and there was nothing left but action and consequence. What about Marcus Chen? The veteran will survive. The patient you saved will have approximately 47 more years of life expectancy, cardiac function restored, future surgeries now possible because his pericardial effusion was addressed. You saved his life, Master Chief. Your cover won't survive that same decision. The drive out of Portland took 2 hours. She watched Cedar Creek Medical disappear in her rearview mirror at 5:13 p.m., the sunset turning the hospital windows red like they were bleeding. The combat boot sat in her passenger seat, the leather still creased from 18 months in her locker. She'd carry those boots to whatever safe house Naval Intelligence had arranged. She'd carry them through whatever debriefing would follow. She'd carry them until someone above her pay grade decided what happened next when a Master Chief Petty Officer's cover was blown because she'd chosen to save a patient instead of protect her mission. The safe house was outside Salem, a small ranch on 5 acres, nothing distinctive, nothing memorable. She arrived at 7:16 p.m. The door was unlocked. The interior smelled of dust and closed windows. A single lamp on the kitchen counter. Instructions printed on white paper: do not use phone. Do not contact anyone. Remain in place until further orders. She placed her military watch beside her dog tags on the kitchen counter, the 2 pieces of her real identity sitting there like accusation and forgiveness at the same time. The watch had been keeping tactical time for 18 months. The dog tags had been hidden under scrubs, beneath her civilian identity, marking her as someone else entirely. Both of them were about to become evidence in something larger than she could see, something that had started the moment she'd stepped into Cedar Creek Medical claiming to be just a nurse. The evening news played on a small television someone had left in the corner. She didn't watch it. She sat on the edge of the kitchen counter and waited for the phone that wouldn't ring, for the orders that would come in ways she couldn't yet imagine, for the moment when the quiet would finally break and everything would change. But that moment was still 23 hours away. For now, there was only silence and the terrible knowledge that she'd made the right choice at the exact worst time, and there was no going back from that decision. 30 minutes after the military liaison stepped into Cedar Creek Medical's lobby, Dr. Caldwell was summoned to the hospital board president's office on the 14th floor. He rode the elevator alone, his reflection fragmenting across the polished steel doors as they rose. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical rhythm above him. He didn't know what was waiting. He should have known. The doors opened to silence. Richard Bancroft sat behind mahogany the color of old blood, the same desk where they'd closed deals over whiskey and handshakes for 17 years. The golf partner. The ally. The man who'd vouched for Caldwell's credibility at 3 different hospital systems. Next to Bancroft sat a Navy officer in dress whites, shoulder boards gleaming with the weight of rank. Cedar Creek's legal counsel occupied the 3rd chair, her briefcase closed like a coffin. "Sit," Bancroft said. "Not an invitation." Caldwell Saturday. The Navy has confirmed that Master Chief Hayes was operating under deep cover investigating a medical fraud network in our surgical department, Bancroft began, his voice stripped of warmth. 18 months. Full federal authority. She was here with a mandate to identify systematic abuse patterns and financial corruption. The room's air pressure seemed to drop. Caldwell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "For surgeons have already been arrested," the Navy officer continued, his voice carrying the flat precision of someone who'd delivered bad news to families in triage tents. Her investigation identified $2.3 million in fraudulent billing, unnecessary procedures, and kickback schemes. Cedar Creek Medical is now the subject of a federal healthcare fraud investigation. Caldwell opened his mouth. Closed it. The pause lasted 3 seconds that felt like artillery strikes. "The complaint you filed with the state licensing board." Bancroft leaned forward. "They're investigating you now. For interference with a federal operation. For deliberately obstructing a Navy investigator conducting classified work inside this facility. They're also questioning whether you knew about the fraud network and were protecting it." The words landed like successive hammer blows. The nursing school you contacted, demanding her complete history and credentials. The legal counsel spoke for the first time, her tone the kind of careful that precedes termination. They've confirmed that Master Chief Hayes holds a degree with distinction in combat nursing, advanced certification as a surgical technician, and trauma medicine training that exceeds most ER physicians on our staff. She's also credentialed by Naval Special Warfare Command as a first responder instructor and surgical trauma specialist. Caldwell's strategic moves collapsed in real time, each one disintegrating like paper in fire. The board members he'd called were already distancing themselves. 3 had left voicemails saying they couldn't comment on pending federal investigations. The nursing school had issued a statement defending her credentials. The ethics committee was disbanding pending review of all his decisions. His network, the intricate web of alliances he'd spent 2 decades weaving, was evaporating. "You threatened to have her arrested," the Navy officer said. His voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage, low, inevitable, carrying the certainty of imminent impact. "You activated a coordinated campaign to destroy her nursing license while she was conducting a classified operation. While she was saving a veteran's life." Caldwell tried to argue. Patient safety. Protocol. He couldn't have known. His actions were justified, reasonable, necessary to maintain professional standards. The officer cut him off with a single raised hand. "You watched a deaf veteran get turned away by 12 different doctors. 12. Each one citing liability concerns they couldn't quantify, communication problems they never attempted to solve, and scheduling conflicts that were never real." Master Chief Hayes stepped in. "Alone. Against your direct threats and institutional authority." The legal counsel slid termination papers across the desk. Crisp. White. Final. "Your contract is terminated for cause, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. Your credentialing privileges are suspended pending the federal investigation. We recommend you retain counsel." The walk out of Cedar Creek Medical felt like walking through a war zone. Security flanked him, professional, neutral, armed with the authority of institutional power that had suddenly switched sides. The lobby had emptied. Staff disappeared into hallways. The Marine Guard who'd recognized Natalie's rank stood by the exit, watching Caldwell with the kind of stare that communicated entire conversations. No anger. Just clarity. The kind that comes from understanding exactly what you're dealing with. News cameras filmed outside. Caldwell's car felt like a shelter under siege. His phone buzzed incessantly. Colleagues suddenly too busy to return calls. Hospital boards that had once competed for his services now had their legal teams craft polite declinations. By evening, his medical license review had been escalated to federal investigators. By midnight, 3 more names were added to the fraud investigation. By dawn, local news had connected Caldwell to the broader scheme, and his face was photographed leaving the courthouse with his attorney. 18 months. That's how long Natalie Hayes had been embedded at Cedar Creek Medical, living her cover as a contract nurse while gathering evidence of the largest hospital fraud scheme in the state's history. 18 months of watching systemic abuse, financial corruption, and the destruction of vulnerable patients who couldn't advocate for themselves. 18 months of maintaining composure while physicians like Caldwell weaponized their authority to protect their profits. 6 months later, the transformation was complete. Dr. Caldwell stood at a folding table outside a strip mall in southwest Portland, wearing a polo shirt with an insurance company logo fading from the sweat that had soaked through the cotton at least 1,000 times. The name tag read simply, Richard. No degree. No credentials. No authority. The supplemental insurance policies were stacked in neat piles on the table, rejection notices outnumbering actual sales by a ratio that made the mathematics of his fall almost poetic. Former colleagues walked past without seeing him. Their children crossed the street rather than acknowledge his presence. The man who'd chaired hospital ethics committees was now selling products that half the population already had, earning commission from policies no one wanted. Meanwhile, at Naval Station Norfolk, Virginia, a commemoration ceremony for Naval Special Warfare Command personnel unfolded in a ballroom that smelled like polished oak and the sharp iron scent of dress uniforms pressed with military precision. Natalie Hayes stood in dress whites, the fabric pristine as snow, her decorations arranged with ceremonial exactitude across her chest. Navy Cross. 2 bronze stars. Purple Heart ribbons faded from Pacific salt spray and Middle Eastern dust. The scars on her hands were visible now, worn openly like badges of territory won at prices no one else had been willing to pay. The citation was read aloud with the weight of official history, her actions at Cedar Creek Medical detailed in the cold language of military commendations. Coordination under adverse conditions. Life-saving intervention in a denied care scenario. Operational completion despite institutional resistance and personal professional consequences. The words made her sound like something from a war correspondent's dispatch, not a nurse in a Portland hospital. Marcus Chen sat in the front row, his sister beside him, both of them in civilian clothes that didn't quite fit the formality of the room. When Natalie's medal was presented, when her rank and accomplishments were formally acknowledged before a room of warriors who understood exactly what those accomplishments cost, Marcus stood. He saluted her with tears streaming down his face, the gesture carrying the weight of gratitude that no civilian vocabulary could contain. His hearing aids amplified nothing. His salute communicated everything. Natalie saluted back, and for the first time in 18 months, her composure fractured. Not in a supply closet. Not in isolation. But in front of witnesses, actual military witnesses who understood that crying after something like this wasn't weakness. It was the release of pressure that had been building since Ramadi. Since the convoy ambush. Since she'd given Marcus her protective gear and carried him 6 miles through enemy fire while hemorrhaging from 2 shrapnel wounds that still ached on cold mornings. After the ceremony, Marcus approached with something cradled carefully in both hands. His worn combat boots, beautifully restored, the leather conditioned back to suppleness, the laces replaced with fresh black cord. "I wanted to return these," he signed, his hands moving with deliberate care. "But I think they did more good with me." Natalie signed back, her hand steadier now, her voice, when she spoke aloud, carrying the command present she'd been forced to hide for 18 months, "Keep them. They're where they belong." She walked through the crowd of service members afterward, finally home among people who understood that the quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. Among people who recognized that institutional hierarchy meant nothing when a human being was drowning. Among people who'd seen what happens when you choose protocol over patience, authority over integrity, your own advancement over someone else's survival. Back at Cedar Creek Medical, in the break room where she'd once poured coffee in the pre-dawn darkness before shift change, a television played the news broadcast of Natalie's commendation. Night shift nurses, her former colleagues, watched in silence. One of them whispered a question that hung in the fluorescent-lit air like a ghost. "She worked beside us for 18 months. We never knew." Another nurse, someone who'd been trained by Natalie in emergency triage, answered quietly, "That's exactly the point." The federal investigation continued for 4 more months. 8 surgeons ultimately faced charges. The hospital settled a $47 million lawsuit. The board rebuilt itself from the foundation up. Cedar Creek Medical became a case study in institutional accountability, taught in healthcare leadership courses as the hospital that didn't know a Navy SEAL was working its flaws, saving patients the system had abandoned. Dr. Richard Caldwell's insurance table lasted 3 weeks before the company quietly terminated his contract. His medical license was revoked. His reputation, the carefully constructed edifice of 17 years, evaporated like morning dew under a sun that had finally come out. And Natalie Hayes, Master Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy Special Warfare Command, returned to her next assignment, her cover irrevocably blown but her mission completed. 12 doctors had refused a deaf veteran. 1 nurse had said yes. 3 days later, the military showed up in force. Justice, when it finally arrived, came not through institutional channels or professional protocols. It came through the hands of someone willing to break every rule to save a life. Sometimes the bravest warriors don't carry guns. Sometimes they carry stethoscopes and the kind of composure that comes from surviving things most people will never even know happened. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. And when that person finally steps into the light, entire systems collapse. If you've ever been underestimated by an authority figure, if you've ever watched institutional power protect itself instead of people, subscribe to see more stories where justice arrives from unexpected places. Like and comment if you believe systems need people willing to break protocol to protect the vulnerable. Hit that notification bell because sometimes the heroes aren't the ones making noise. They're the ones standing in silence, doing what's right when everything costs.